All right, so in this lecture video, we're going to start moving into one of the different uh, kind of subspecialties in biology, which is a field known as ecology. Now, what is ecology? Well, ecology is defined as the study of interrelationships of different organisms with each other and with their environments. So, in other words, it's essentially the study of how organisms interact with each other, with other species, and how they interact with the world around them. The actual meaning of the word ecology was originally given by a German biologist by the name of Haeckel in 1869. Now, the word itself is derived from two Greek words, the first being oikos, meaning house, habitat, or place of living, and logos, meaning study or to study. So, ecology is the study of living things in their habitat. Now, I like to think of everything in the environment as being interconnected by this delicate network of interrelationships. And these relationships drive many different processes and dynamics, as well as kind of um, allow for the functioning of an ecosystem, which we'll talk about as far as an ecosystem, what that is in a little bit. But when we talk about humans, when we think of human beings, we tend to dissociate ourselves from the natural world, which is not good because the survival of our species has depended on and has always depended on actually our ability to observe variations in our environment, in the natural world, and predict the responses that organisms might have to those variations, right? So, for example, go back to the earliest hunters and gatherers. They had to know the habitats that their prey occupied and where to find edible plants. They had to know the kind of migration or movement patterns of prey species for hunts. Moving ahead in time with agriculturalists, right? So agriculturalists have to be aware of variations in weather and soil and how much such of these variations may affect their crops or their livestock, or how to tell what nutrients may be depleted from their soil and why that may be occurring. We fast forward to today, modern times. Again, most modern populations have very little to no direct contact with nature. And now more than ever, the future of our species depends on how well we understand the relationships between different organisms and their environments, largely for the conservation of other species. The conservation of those species allows for the conservation of environments, which allows for the conservation of ecological services that are important to our survival, and therefore they're important to the survival of our species. So our species is rapidly changing Earth's environment, but we do not fully understand the consequences of these changes. For instance, we've influenced nitrogen cycling, or the quantity of nitrogen cycling through the biosphere with fertilization and runoff from agricultural stores. We've influenced the distribution of non-native floral and faunal species. Right? My poor parents in Pennsylvania are dealing with the horrific spotted lanternflies that are now taking over the entire Bucks County and Berks County areas. And they're non-native invasive species that was brought in from Japan and other regions of Asia with cultivars, or your landscape species. and they're causing huge issues. They're devastating the pine species. So we're dealing with consequences like that. Also, increased atmospheric CO2 levels. That's a big talk about the um, greenhouse effect. Now, changes such as these, they all threaten the diversity of life on Earth, and they, by doing so, endanger our support system. You can think of the Earth as, or the landscape of the Earth as essentially being the lungs of the Earth, and without that diversity, biodiversity being the lungs, you have the collapse of ecosystems and therefore the collapse of different species. Now, when we talk about ecology, right, that's kind of going into why it's so important, or why the field of ecology is so important, why it's so important to understand the relationship that organisms have with one another and with the environment around them. Now, the actual field of ecology is very, very broad. It can be broken up into many different levels, per se, in the fact that it addresses environmental relationships ranging from kind of the level of an individual organism all the way to factors that influence global scale processes. Right? So it can stem from all the way from the individual to the level of the biosphere, which is this global scale level. The biosphere refers to all areas of Earth that support life or organisms. Now we can kind of organize this broad range of levels into a hierarchy of ecological organization, where here we have individual, population, community, ecosystem, biome, and biosphere. I like to break it down this way. It's kind of an old-fashioned way, but it goes more of biosphere, region, landscape, ecosystem, community, interactions, populations, and individuals. So you kind of look at interactions as a kind of a separate component that allows you to delve a little deeper into that. Figaro, can you not knock stuff off my bookshelf? Figaro has a secondary bacterial infection in his upper respiratory tract. So he is on kitty steroid right now, such as prednisone, to help that out, but that's making him very, very kooky. So I apologize for any onslaughts of rambunctiousness that ensue during this video. Anyway, back to what I was saying. So, all right, let's talk about each of these levels real quick. Well, obviously, individual is just the individual organism itself. Population, this is a group of individuals of the same species living and interacting in one area. So, for example, a herd of elephants in the Serengeti in Africa. Community, these are comprised of multiple populations that interact with one another in one area. So with our Serengeti example, this would be kind of a community, would be grazing antelope, elephants, and giraffes. Right? All three of those interacting in one area comprise a community. Now, an ecosystem, this refers or is comprised of all populations in one area interacting with each other and their non-living environment. So again, in the Serengeti, it's all organisms plus their environment, and then abiotic factors like climate, nutrients, soil, etc. We'll go more into depth with ecosystem in a little bit. But let's go into, before that, we'll go into biomes. Biomes are or refer to these very large, naturally occurring communities of plants and animals that all have common characteristics for the environment that they exist in. Now, they can be found, as far as biomes, they can be found over a range of continents, and there's a huge diversity of different biomes that exist. You can go into wetlands. So wetlands itself is a biome, but then there are several hundred, maybe, different subbiomes per se within wetlands. Like you have the marshlands, you have your salt marshes, you have the Laurentian wetlands, the temperate wetlands, et cetera, et cetera. Based, again, all of those are comprised of these common communities of flora and fauna that separate them from other biome areas. You can think of them as essentially being these predictable landscape clustering or landscape features per se. So a lot of them will have these distinct biological communities that have actually formed in response to a shared physical climate, right? So often you will see particular biomes occupying a particular climatic area. Most of them are distinguished primarily by their predominant plants and are, again, associated with a particular climate. You can consider a good example would be the kind of distinguishing deserts and tropical rainforest biomes, right? They both consist of distinct plant formations that differ from one another, as well as particular climatic differences. And because there's that element of kind of shared physical climate and that having a role on the distinct biological communities that exist there, the natural histories of each biome differ a great deal from one another as well. Now, kind of talking about some of these specific biomes. Obviously, my favorite, or the one that I'm most familiar with, is with the savanna biome. So the savannas of Africa. I've done copious amounts of work in different regions of Africa, primarily regions of South Africa and Botswana. And Africa is well distinguished for the savanna regions. Right, this is the kind of most frequent biome that you find in the different areas of Africa. Now, savannas themselves, there's again specific features or typical features that distinguish this biome. For example, there's wet and dry seasons. So in general, there's a reduced rainfall and these prolonged dry seasons. Most of the areas are open grassland regions with scattered shrubs and tree species. A lot of them are fire adapted, so they're often maintained by periodic fires. And the food web is dominated by really large herbivores, particularly ungulates, which are your hoofed species, and then the predators of those herbivores. Some other biomes, as far as different terrestrial biomes, so these are biomes that are occurring over wide areas of terrestrial communities. Some main ones are your tropical and temperate rainforests. So this is a picture from when I was working in the lowland rainforests of Ecuador. Rainforests are well known for extremely high levels of humidity. My friend and I, when we were researching in Ecuador, would often say that you would take a shower and your hair would remain wet for like a week. It was pretty icky, but this is a very rich biome. It's actually the richest biome in terms of number of species. There's substantial rainfall throughout the year, and a huge diversity of plant species. and a lot of competition for sunlight. You also have, you can see kind of here, really neat species and communities of epiphytes, which are plant species that actually take hold and grow on the branches and limbs of other trees. So this helps create all these really intricate microhabitats that really amplify vertical stratification throughout the different canopy layers of your rainforests. Obviously, deserts, they're a big one. So extremely low rainfall, very arid, harsh conditions. Usually they will occur at the continental interiors and on the what we call the leeward side of mountain ranges. So it creates what's known as a rain shadow effect, where the rain will come in on onto a mountain, and as it crosses over that mountain range, all that moisture is lost. So basically the other half, or that leeward side of the mountain, remains dry. It does not receive any rain. Now you can have both cold and hot deserts. There are cold deserts that exist in some of the more northern, kind of going into tundra regions that are just as dry per se, or categorized as these desert environments. Most of them, in general, if you look at a map, they occur at or near 30 degrees latitude, north or south. Let's see, some other good ones. Temperate grasslands, right? So they're also called plains or prairies. Most of them are either fire adapted, so they're subjected to periodic burning events or fires, or they're maintained by grazing by large herbivores. Most of the grasslands in the United States have now been converted to agricultural areas, which is not good because that creates monocultures, which decreases soil diversity. Let's see here. Ooh, so your boreal forests, they're also known as coniferous or northern coniferous forests. They're found in northern regions of North America and Eurasia. They're known for their long, cold, dry winters. They're actually one of the largest size terrestrial biomes. There's a very, very short growing season because of the harsh conditions, which makes it well suited for these conifer species rather than deciduous trees. Unfortunately, most of these areas in the United States are either in the process of or have been logged at a tremendous rate for the great wood, per se, that can be found there. There's also something similar, which are your temperate evergreen forests. They are also known as your old growth forests. So they're very important as far as the timber industry, which is why there's very little of these biomes left. But most of them occur on coastline regions in northwestern United States. So you can think of Seattle, Washington. Cold weather or cool weather, dense fog, high precipitation, very damp per se. So these guys are the kind of the major floral species occupying these areas are your large evergreen. On the topic of colder areas, your tundras and also these fragile alpine communities. Tundras are very, very cold with very high winds, very low precipitation, and a very short growing season. So you can think of them as almost being these cold deserts. There's a permanent sheet of ice underlying the surface of the ground layer that's called permafrost. Most of them, of these biomes, occur in the far northern regions, so in the Arctic areas or high mountain areas, which is where you can find the alpine communities. Chaparral is basically dominated by these spiny evergreen shrubs, very dry climate in the summer, and they're also dominated by fire-adapted species. So a lot of the plant species that actually grow here require fire, in that in order for their seeds to germinate, they need to have these periodic fires that will activate the seeds to come out of dormancy and therefore germinate. Very, very interesting dynamics. So some other ones that are well known again are your wetlands, montane rainforests. So you can kind of think of this as being like a temperate evergreen forest, but a tropical rainforest version of a temperate evergreen forest. You have a high diversity of plant species, but the temperatures are much cooler than what you find in your lowland tropical and temperate rainforests. Dense fog cover, high precipitation, a lot of epiphytes that grow as well. And most of these will occur in your upper elevation. So you find a lot of the montane rainforests as you increase elevation in the Andes mountains. Now, as I was saying before when I was talking about these different biomes, a lot of them are known for or named based on the predominant plant species that comprise them. We refer to these species with a term called ecological dominance. These are just dominant species. More specifically, you determine ecological dominance based on the degree to which a taxon is more numerous than its competitors within a community, or how much biomass it contributes to, or how much of the total biomass it makes up in a community. Now, as such, with this role of dominance, these dominant species greatly influence the distribution of other living organisms. So they can help, again, define the ecosystem as well as its characteristics. Now, kind of giving you an example of one of these. If you think about, let's see a good example. So the wet woodlands in Western Europe. In many of these communities, they are dominated by a tree species known as alder. So that dominant tree species is again, the dominant species of these wet woodland communities. It's kind of the species that defines that ecological community. And that concept, or because that species of alder takes up so much or makes up such a large degree of the total biomass in these ecological communities, it displays a high amount of ecological dominance. Now, ecological dominance is very different from another type of species type or species role in a community, known as keystone species. Keystone species play a crucial role in maintaining the structure and function of an ecological community. Now, your keystone species are not necessarily the largest species, nor are they necessarily the most abundant species, right? So they are not necessarily the species that are most dominant, but they have or play a crucial role in maintaining the functioning of a community, particularly a role that is difficult to be filled by another species. Right? So if you lost that keystone species, it's unlikely that there may be another species to occupy that niche that the keystone species occupied and therefore provide that same ecological role in the ecosystem. Now, some great examples, most of them are your apex predators, in that they act as a cap on your trophic systems to prevent the overpopulation and over production of smaller carnivore or your herbivore species. So one example would be with the hunting of gray wolf populations back in 1915, when hunters kind of went on this huge scheme to eradicate apex predators. By taking out apex predators, particularly wolves, it allowed for a type of or a group of carnivore species that are known as mesopredators to really blossom and overtake populations. Mesopredators are coyotes, foxes, raccoons. When they were originally kept in control, or their population size was originally kept in control by the presence of an apex predator. You remove that capstone, there's no cap that's now controlling those populations, which can allow certain communities to inundate an area and prevent other species from being able to populate an area. Sea otters, right? So these guys are ridiculously cute, but they also happen to be really important. They're a keystone species as well. They're an important predator of sea urchins. So they keep sea urchin populations in control, which allows the kelp populations and other marine vegetative species to flourish. If you have the population or overabundance of sea urchin, it can actually really damage or destroy kelp forests. And kelp provide food sources for other species. So if you take out kelp, you lose a food group that could be supporting certain species within that trophic system, and then those species, their survival and fitness is therefore jeopardized. So a lot of times when you remove a keystone species, and an ecosystem is at risk for what is known as trophic cascade, which is when you literally have a domino effect move through an ecosystem where the removal of one species has or casts an array of direct and indirect impacts on all species of that system. And you can actually start destroying an ecosystem either from the top down, that would be if you removed the apex predator, or from the bottom up, if you removed a key vegetative species or a large vegetative population. So that's why it's, again, with ecology, it's important to know these dynamics, to understand the roles that different species play as far as maintaining ecosystem functioning or how they may support other species. It's also important to know the dynamics between species, their interactions. So if you remove one species from a population that's a nuisance species, it may actually greatly impact the health of that ecosystem because it helped to control another population. And now that population would grow out of control and can destroy an ecosystem. So you really need to understand these interrelationships that are very, very fragile and intricate, to understand how any action that you may take, even if it's with the best of intentions, may impact that environment. All right, so sorry, I'm eating while I talk. I'm sitting here recording my lecture, finally done with teaching classes, only to realize that I did not eat the entire day. So that might be why I feel a little bit wobbly. So food is good. Anyway, so ecosystems, right? I keep mentioning this term, but I haven't really explained it yet. So the term ecosystem was first proposed by a man named A.G. Tinsley in 1935. And he defined an ecosystem as being the system resulting from the interaction of all living and non-living factors in the environment. Right? So when we talk about an ecosystem consists of the biological community or communities that occur in some region, and then all of the biotic and abiotic factors that make up that community. So biotic factors are physical factors. This would be the organisms themselves, the different plant species, the faunal species. Biotic factors are chemical or non-living factors. These are or would be inert elements of an ecosystem that interact with the living components. Now, the way that abiotic factors interact with a particular ecosystem is what determines or plays a role in determining the types of plants and animals, or the flora and faunal species that can occupy an ecosystem. Now, what are some examples of abiotic factors? Well, this could be the amount of water, degree of sunlight, temperature, soil, nutrient enrichment, climate, humidity, oxygen content, pH, salinity, all of those quote unquote non-living aspects of an ecosystem that are just as equally important as the species that occupy that ecosystem as far as maintaining it. So when you talk about an ecosystem, you have to consider both the physical and non-physical aspects of a biological community. Now, the kind of what actually builds up an ecosystem, or what lays the foundation for an ecosystem, again, are the interactions of the biotic and abiotic factors, and therefore the interactions of organisms with their physical environment, as well as the interactions of organisms with the non-physical or abiotic components. In general, these organisms occupy different communities that will function together and interact with the environment in order to sustain it. So what you end up seeing is this flow of energy and cycling of materials between different components of an ecosystem. Now, when we talk about ecosystems as well, what's important to understand is that ecosystems are open systems. Hence, they are not self-sustaining. They require an energy input, such as from the sun, and often a nutrient input, as from the leaching of minerals that may be pulled out and carried by the processes of erosion into the sediment layers of lakes. Ecosystems will maintain themselves by cycling energy and nutrients that are obtained from external sources. Because energy cannot be recycled, again, all ecosystems have to have an energy output. Most often it's in the form of low-grade heat that's lost to the environment during each energy transfer between organisms. It just coincides with the second law of thermodynamics, wherein, and the first law of thermodynamics being that you cannot create or destroy energy. You can only change the form of energy. And then the second law being that for every transfer of energy or energy transformation, a certain amount of heat is released or lost to the environment, and that contributes to the entropy of the environment. Now, this flow of energy in the ecosystem that's derived and maintained by kind of the organism environment interaction leads to a clearly defined trophic structure with biotic diversity, and also to the cycling exchange of materials between both living and non-living components or parts of that ecosystem. Right, so over here we have a typical or familiar trophic system. At the first trophic level are your primary producers. So these would be plants, algae, even some bacteria. Species that use solar energy to produce organic plant material through photosynthesis. Now your second trophic level are made up of your primary consumers, which are your herbivores. Right? These are animals that feed solely on plants. The next level up are secondary consumers. Right? These are predators that eat herbivores in order to obtain energy. So these guys, these predator species, occupy that third trophic level. Now, in some ecosystems, you'll have even larger predator species kind of occupying the level above that third trophic level, a lot of these being apex predators. They, again, will occupy or serve as caps on trophic systems and will obtain their energy by feeding on any of the mammal species below them, primarily the secondary consumers. Now, there's one that's often forgotten as far as trophic levels, which is your decomposers. Right? So decomposers are just as important as any of your other trophic levels. These include different types of bacteria, fungi, mold species, worms, insects. Basically, you can think of them as nature's recyclers. They break down waste and dead organisms and return those nutrients back to the soil. So they allow for, again, that cycling of nutrients back to the start. Now, on average, we'll talk more about kind of the energy of an ecosystem in a moment, but on average, about 10% of net energy production at one trophic level is passed on to the next level. Now, processes that reduce the amount of energy that's transferred between trophic levels and cause that kind of net gain of only 10% include processes, mostly cellular processes, such as respiration, growth, reproduction, defecation, and natural death, right? So organisms will die, but those organisms are not eaten by consumers. So you don't have an actual nutritional gain. Now, the nutritional quality of the material that is consumed will also influence how efficiently energy is transferred, right? Because consumers can convert high quality food sources into new living tissue far more efficiently than they can with low quality food sources. As well, a larger or a more nutritionally dense 10% of energy can be passed on from these high quality food sources rather than low quality food sources. So looking more at quality rather than quantity. So when we talk about the cycles in an ecosystem, again, the main ones are energy and nutrients. They help to sustain that ecosystem. Energy flows through ecosystems, which is why, in the sense energetically, your ecosystems are open systems. Because nutrients cycle within ecosystems, right? It's maintained in just that ecosystem complex. There's no real input or output. You have a closed system, right? Based on that component. With your decomposers, kind of going back to them. So looking at the cycle, it largely starts with your inorganic nutrient pool and producers. Your producers will pass on or provide energy and nutrients to consumers. Consumers provide energy and nutrients to decomposers. Decomposers will use both producers and consumers for obtaining nutrients and energy. In the process, they release energy as heat, but they can then essentially regenerate or reintroduce the organic matter of these levels back into the inorganic nutrient pool. So you can continue that cycling of nutrients within an environment. So again, you can think of them as recycling or returning nutrients to the ecosystem. More specifically, they're processing these large amounts of organic matter and returning those amounts of organic material back to the ecosystem in the form of nutrients, more specifically in inorganic form, which can then be taken up again by your primary producers, and the cycle continues. Now, energy, if you look here, it is not cycled. So again, energy is an open system. You have an input, you also have an output because energy is lost. So energy is not recycled during decomposition. Instead, it's released as heat. And this is why if any of you have compost piles, in the winter, you'll usually see heat rising off or steam coming off of your compost piles, and why fresh garden mulch is so warm. It's because of this decomposition activity that's releasing energy as it's processing organic material. Now, The existence of the living world, again, depends on the flow of energy and the circulation of materials and nutrients throughout an ecosystem. There are different factors that can affect this, right? The influence of the abundance of organisms, the rate at which they live, the complexity of the community, the diversity of the community. All of those can be factors that affect these cycles or systems per se. Probably more particularly with your materials, since such is going to recirculate. The flow of energy is more of a one-way flow. It's used by, or once it's used by the community, it's lost. So it enters and then it leaves. It doesn't remain in that system. Now, I don't mean to kind of belabor this, but before we do move on, I do want to mention that the cycle from non-living to living back to non-living, that more or less circular path does have a name. It's called the biogeochemical cycle. Biogeochemical cycles are important because they help retain vital nutrients in forms that are usable for and by plants and animals, and also because they help to, again, maintain the stability of ecosystems. If nutrient cycling did not occur, the amount of necessary elements would continuously decrease and would make the development of stable and plant and animal populations virtually impossible. It would be impossible because, again, there would be no continuous addition or reintroduction of nutrients into that population. Now, there are basically two types of biogeochemical cycles. You can have gaseous and sedimentary cycles. The type depends on the primary source for the nutrient involved, whether it happens to be air and water, which is your gaseous cycles, or if it's primarily involving soil and rocks, which would be your sedimentary. Now, elements move about by the gaseous cycle pretty much more efficiently. The recycling of these elements is much faster and much more efficient than what you see with the sedimentary cycle. The kind of molecular compounds or players in the gaseous cycle: carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, hydrogen. Most of your inorganics, or what we would find in the inorganic nutrient pool, contribute to the cycles that operate via sedimentary pattern. So this would be examples of nutrients like iron, calcium, and phosphorus. And we'll actually talk about several of these cycles in a few moments, which is why I like to bring it up now, but also so you recognize the importance of, again, really honing in the importance of energy and nutrient cycling in sustaining an ecosystem. It's so much more than just the species that occupy an area, which is again why with ecosystems you consider both the biotic and abiotic components. Now, when we talk about energy and kind of nutrition, as far as the gain of nutrients, we like to talk about the productivity of an ecosystem. In ecology, productivity is the rate at which energy is added to the bodies of an organism or all organisms in a certain area, and that energy is added in the form of biomass. What the heck is biomass? Well, it's basically exactly as it sounds and as it's spelled. Biomass is simply the amount of matter that's stored in the bodies of a group of organisms. Now, productivity specifically can be defined at any trophic level or other group, and it may take units of either energy, so you usually see it in joules or J, or biomass. Now, the actual conversion of energy into biomass over a given amount of time, and that's productivity, but we can further break that into two basic types of productivity. Those two types being gross productivity and net productivity. Gross productivity refers to the overall rate of energy captured, right? So how much energy is in total initially is captured and gained at a certain trophic level, or of the whole ecosystem, if you're considering the entire trophic system. Net productivity, on the other hand, is taking gross productivity, but you are taking into consideration energy consumption, right? So you're taking into consideration the percentage of that gross productivity, that original amount of energy that was captured, that will be lost to growth processes or lost as heat to the environment, lost in cellular respiration, etc., etc. So you're accounting for that small amount of energy that is lost due to the activities of an organism. So it's more of the true energy that is yielded or available in an ecosystem. Again, all that energy that's originally captured is not going to be available because some of it will be lost in order to sustain the functioning of that organism itself. Only a small percentage of it, that net productivity, will actually be available for use or consumption by other organisms. Now, again, you can talk about productivity at any trophic level. Usually we talk about it at primary and secondary trophic levels, right? So primary productivity, right? This is the productivity of your primary producers, and majority of which are your plants. And in this, you have both gross primary production, or GPP, and net primary production or productivity, which is NPP. Now, gross primary productivity, this is the rate at which solar energy is captured in or by sugar molecules during photosynthesis, right? So it's the amount of energy captured per area per unit time. Now, most of your producers, actually all of your producers, will use some of this energy for metabolism or cellular respiration, and some of it for growth or development, so building tissues, for example, which is what we show here. So this is the total amount or total assimilation of energy that is gained by this little leaf here. But not all of that energy or gained energy is going to be available to as energy to be passed on to other consumers, right? So entire thing is the gross primary production, the amount that's actually truly available to be given to or passed on to other consumers as energy is your net primary production. Right? So this again is gross primary productivity minus the rate of energy loss due to processes such as metabolism and maintenance. So it's the rate at which energy is stored as biomass and then made available to consumers in the ecosystem. Now, when we talk about plants, right, plants are an easy one to talk about for we're talking about primary producers. Plants will typically capture and convert about 1.3 to 1.6% of the solar energy that reaches the Earth's surface. And they will use about a quarter of that energy that's captured for metabolism and maintenance. So only about 1% of the solar energy that actually reaches Earth's surface per unit area per time actually ends up as net primary productivity. Now, the actual measure of net or amount of net primary productivity, that's going to vary among your ecosystems because it's dependent on a variety of factors. Right? These factors include solar energy input, temperature, moisture level, carbon dioxide levels, nutrient availability, community interactions, right? So is there a lot of grazing by herbivores, or is there not quite as much herbivory occurring, but rather plants defend themselves using chemicals or tannins? Those are all factors that will affect how many photosynthesizers are present to capture light energy and how efficiently they can perform their role of acquiring sunlight energy, transforming it into a usable energy source, and passing on an amount of that to other consumers while also using an amount of that gained energy for their own growth. Now, just as you can have primary productivity, production can also occur in animals as secondary production. Secondary production describes the generation of biomass by heterotrophic organisms or the different consumers within a system. Now, this is driven by the transfer of organic material between trophic levels and essentially represents the quantity of new tissue that's created in the system through the use of what we call assimilated food. Right, so this is food that's or energy that's actually allocated to growth and development of new biomass. Again, produces new tissue. Now, unlike primary productivity, more specifically primary net productivity, secondary net productivity involves feeding or absorption. So again, the generation of biomass is driven by the transfer of organic compounds between your different levels in a trophic system via feeding activity. Now, when one animal consumes another animal, they do not use all of the biomass that they consume. There's a small amount that goes into growth, right? And that's represented by growth and cellular respiration, right? This is your assimilated food. Again, the percentage of that consumed biomass that's actually used for growth and development. A large amount of the energy that they consume is lost in waste. So again, here's your total, right? The gross secondary productivity, right? The total energy or biomass that's assimilated by consumers. And then you have your net. Net being your gross secondary productivity minus fecal loss and respiratory loss. So you're factoring in, again, the amount that's lost to actual growth, as well as respirative activities and also feces. Now, as with your primary productivity, the net secondary productivity represents the gain by consumers in energy or biomass per unit area, per unit time that's remaining after allowing for respiratory losses, right? So just as before, it's your gross secondary productivity or gross productivity minus respiratory loss. Now, there are wonderful ways in which we can actually depict visually the relationships between organisms at various trophic levels of food chain and their interactions with energy flow and biomass. We call these graphical representations ecological pyramids, also known as trophic pyramids, Plutonian pyramids, etc. They're all designed to show the biomass or bioproductivity at each trophic level in a given ecosystem. It also helps to provide this intuitive visual picture of how the trophic levels in an ecosystem compare for some feature of interest. Now, in general, all of your ecological pyramids are, well, in the shape of a pyramid. The concept was actually first introduced by a British ecologist named Charles Elton. With your pyramids, typically the bottom of these ecological pyramids are the broadest levels, and they're occupied usually by your producers. So that forms that first trophic level. The first trophic level is usually the lowest trophic level. Now, just in as you see in a food chain, your producers are consumed by the primary consumers, and that is that next level. And then your primary consumers are consumed by secondary consumers, which make up another or next level on the pyramid, and then lastly your tertiary consumers. Now, depending on the factors that we are using to represent an ecological period, or what factors are of interest to analyze in a different ecosystem, we can create one of three types of pyramids. You have the pyramid of energy, pyramid of biomass, pyramid of numbers. Now, the pyramid of numbers, what this deals with, or in the pyramid of number, what you're taking into account is the actual number of organisms in each trophic level, right? So it just shows, okay, how many organisms occupy the first trophic level, right? How many organisms represent your primary producers? How many individual organisms are there that act as primary consumers. Now, as we go up the levels in the pyramid, that number should decrease, meaning the number of organisms in each successively higher trophic level should decrease, right? Meaning, again, you have more at the bottom to support less at the top. That has to do with energy that's lost in general. You need more bodies at these base structures to support the larger bodies and structures of your higher level consumers, because again, they are already consuming a reduced amount of energy from these guys. Now, the other one, we'll talk about pyramid of energy. Usually, this one is represented as an upright pyramid, what you see here. This represents the flow of energy through each trophic level, right? So the flow of energy from your producers all the way to the final consumers. These ones will also be broadest at the bottom, narrowest at the top. So they narrow or become more narrow at each successive level. And this pattern represents the law of thermodynamics, the different laws of thermodynamics, which tell us, again, that new energy can't be created and some must be converted and lost to a non-usable form of heat for each transfer of energy. Now, usually when we talk about energy, we talk about calories or joules of energy. In general, energy is required for various processes of growth, photosynthesis, respiration, metabolism. Bless you, Fishio. And then for each of those processes, when you have an energy transfer, some of that energy is lost as heat. So for every chemical process that happens in your body, you're releasing heat as a byproduct, right? That's what we mean when we say you're burning calories. And as I had mentioned before, only about 10% of the available energy within one trophic level is transferred or available to be transferred to the next successive or higher trophic level. We call this the rule of 10, right? So each energy transfer, only a tenth of that original, or 10% of that original energy is being passed on or available for the successive trophic level, which is what I meant when I was over here talking about how for each, when we talk about the numbers, there's more at the bottom to support less at the top. It's because the energy that this guy, your little fox here, is getting is already a fractive amount of energy based on the total amount of energy that was originally consumed or available in plants. So when you get up to your secondary consumers, only 1%, they only have 1% of the original 100% of energy that was available with your primary producers. So when your third level consumers consume a secondary consumer, they are consuming that tiny 1% of energy. But the amount of that energy, of that 1% that they actually retain and use for creating biomass and growth is only 0.1%, right? So they only acquire 0.1% of 1% of the energy that's given to them. So 0.1% of 1% is tiny. So again, a very, very minimal amount of energy is actually acquired by these guys. So they must eat much more of the lower trophic level species in order to acquire a adequate amount of energy to sustain their life and cellular functioning. So a lot of people, when they think about energy in ecosystems, they think it's efficient. It's really not. It is not an efficient system at all. Again, because of those laws of thermodynamics, each transfer of energy, you lose a certain percentage of that energy as heat. Specifically here, only 10% is then made available for the next trophic level. So don't make that mistake of thinking that energy transfers and energy within ecosystems is an efficient process. It is not. Again, it has a 10%. It's inefficient by about 10%. The last pyramid is the pyramid of biomass. These pyramids represent the amount of energy that's stored in living tissue at the different trophic levels. Right? So unlike energy pyramids, the biomass pyramids show how much biomass is actually present at a level. It doesn't show the rate at which it's added. Right? This pyramid of energy, by knowing that rule of 10, gives us an idea of the rate at which energy is gained at a trophic level and how much consumption must occur, or the rate of consumption that must occur in order to sustain that trophic level. With the biomass period, it's just, all right, how much biomass is present, not what's the rate at which biomass is being gained. As I said before, biomass is nothing but really just the weight of the organism, how much mass or tissue it contributes in an ecosystem. Now, in general, like most of the other ecological periods, the pyramid of biomass is usually upright. But there are some cases where it'll actually be inverted. Right? So a great example is with zooplankton and plankton. Right? So in this case, an inverted pyramid is possible because of the high turnover rate of phytoplankton. They get eaten rapidly by the primary consumers, which are your zooplankton. So their biomass at any point in time is small. However, they reproduce so fast that despite that very low steady state level of biomass, they have a high primary productivity that can support these really large numbers of zooplankton. So again, it creates this inverted pyramid where you actually have a larger consumer population, or that primary consumer trophic level has a broader or larger biomass state per se than the primary producers. Right, so basically you would take this pyramid, you turn it upside down. This would be your secondary consumers. Your smaller or narrower level would be the primary producers. So that's what I mean by an inverted pyramid, where you actually have a smaller population of producers supporting a larger population of consumers. All right, so moving on. Hopefully you haven't fallen asleep yet. we're going to move out of talking about energy and go more into talking about those biogeochemical cycles that I had mentioned before with nutrient and material cycling. Now there's several cycles we'll talk about. Carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, phosphorus cycle. We're going to start with the carbon. So carbon is a basic constituent of all organic compounds. Now, since energy transfer occurs as the consumption and storage of carbohydrates and fats, carbon atoms will move through the ecosystem kind of in parallel or in synchrony with the flow of energy. Now, take a guess. What do you think is the major source of carbon on Earth? If you said carbon dioxide, you would be correct. The source of nearly all carbon found in living organisms is carbon dioxide, which is available freely in the environment and also in the in dissolved forms in water sources. Now, when we talk about the carbon cycle, right, we'll focus on CO2 here. The first step is the utilization of carbon dioxide or uptake of carbon dioxide by living organisms through the process of photosynthesis by your plant species. Now, in photosynthesis, carbon in combination with oxygen and hydrogen in the presence of sunlight is converted into these simple carbohydrates, and those in turn are synthesized by the plant into complex fats and polysaccharides. Now, these polysaccharides and fats that are made are stored in plant tissues, which are then eaten by animals, which digest and resynthesize those carbon compounds into different compounds, right? Digestible forms of those compounds. Meat-eating animals feeding on the herbivores, again, ingest those carbon compounds. So those carbon compounds that were rearranged are again redigested and then resynthesized into other forms that are usable and suitable for that species. Now, some of your carbon dioxide is returned to the atmosphere directly, since carbon dioxide is a byproduct of respiration both in plants and animals. You can also have carbon dioxide that is kind of locked into or loaded into animal waste, as well as kind of locked in the protoplasm of plants. Both of these kind of sources of locked carbon will be released when the organism decays, right? So that's where microbial decomposition comes into play. So microbial decomposition will allow for the release of carbon, right? Bacteria and fungi will start digesting and feeding on the remains of those organisms. And in the process, they break down those complex compounds into very simple compounds, kind of the simple subunits, which are then available for another round of carbon cycle. Now, after the work of microbial decomposition, most organic carbon it kind of is returned as carbon dioxide again. Part of the organic carbon becomes incorporated into the biomass per se of the planet, and that it's incorporated in the Earth's crust as either some of your fossil fuels, so coal, gas, petroleum. It also can be incorporated as limestone or coral reefs. Now, some of these deposits can be removed from circulation for long periods of time. Usually that errs on the side of permanent. Others are liberated by industrial and agricultural processes, which will access these products, right? So fossil fuel use, cement, land use, change, etc., will release these stored or locked forms in the Earth's crust, releasing carbon dioxide into the environment. Sometimes it's not because of anthropogenic sources. It might be natural sources, such as erosion, right? So erosion and weathering can release carbon dioxide from sources like limestone back into the environment. But in general, the largest amount of carbon in this circulation, or the largest amount of carbon circulated through an ecosystem, depends on living organisms. So more of this terrestrial biotic uptake and processing. So that's kind of simple, quick and dirty, a look at your carbon cycle. Nitrogen cycle, another really important one. So a lot of people forget how important nitrogen is. Nitrogen is crucial for all organisms because it's an essential part of proteins and nucleic acids. Now, about 78% of the atmosphere, nitrogen gas, or your N2, kind of serves as that largest reservoir of any element. So in its gaseous form, as atmospheric and nitrogen, or N2, nitrogen is actually useless to most organisms. But different organisms have adapted strategies that allow for nitrogen fixation, right? So they are able to acquire atmospheric nitrogen and essentially transform it into a form that is usable or fixable, so that they can actually acquire and hold on to that nitrogen. And by doing so, that nitrogen becomes quote unquote fixed in that organism and can then be passed on to other organisms through consumption and assimilation. So a lot of these routes of nitrogen fixation occur in different types of bacteria and algae that are found in soil and wet habitats. Also, there's different types of kind of fixation strategies that deal with atmospheric conditions, which we'll talk about in a moment. But with these kind of biologic means of nitrogen fixation, these guys will convert that inorganic nitrogen into usable forms, particularly your nitrates, that can be immediately used by plants and therefore fixed or incorporated into that ecosystem and that food chain. Now, when a plant or animal dies, decomposing or your decomposer bacteria and fungi species will start to break down that body. So the body begins to decay by their activity, which allows for the breakdown of these nitrogen-containing amino acids. And when those amino acids are broken down, it releases nitrogen gas, which is NH3. Some of the bacteria, we call them the nitrifying bacteria or nitrite bacteria, they can convert that ammonia into nitrites. So they'll convert, you have ammonia, it's converted into ammonium. They'll basically nitrify, or that ammonium will go through nitrification by these bacteria species to be transformed into a usable form, which are nitrites. Now at this point, basically another bacteria called your nitrate bacteria will come along. They added a third oxygen atom to the nitrite, and that produces nitrates. Now, once you're at your nitrates, you've had the nitrates produced, you've basically gone full circle, because the plants are basically now able to access a usable form of nitrogen again. Right? It was a unusable form during the decomp, and then because of the action of these nitrifying bacteria, it's reconverted into a reusable form. So bacteria basically reintroduce it back into the cycle. And that can also allow nitrogen to return back to the atmospheric reservoir. Another way at which nitrogen can be fixed, as I said before, was more of these atmospheric conditions. With that, it's not nitrogen fixing bacteria or fungi that are in operation. Rather, it's actually the process of lightning, electrification by lightning. In this case, the energy of a lightning bolt passing through the atmosphere binds nitrogen and oxygen together, and that forms nitrate. And that nitrate will precipitate onto the soil from the air during electrical storms. And in that form of nitrate, it can be picked up and consumed or assimilated into plants. So that's more of this abiotic nitrogen fixation process. That's really cool. It also gives you a new appreciation for lightning. All right, so next cycle we have here is the phosphorus cycle. Phosphorus cycle is more of the sedimentary pattern as far as the biogeochemical cycles. Phosphorus is necessary, particularly in the hereditary material of DNA. It's also crucial in other cellular molecules, and also in the structure of bone in your vertebrate species. Now the principle of reservoir, you're probably wondering, where the heck do you see like a large sink or source of phosphorus? Well, the principle of reservoir for this cycle is phosphate rock, which was formed in historic or past geologic ages. There's also so more of your sedimentary rock during burial. There's also a large amount of phosphate phosphate that's contributed into the atmosphere and the environment through excrement. More specifically, guano deposits by fish-eating seabirds and fossil deposits. Now, erosion by rainfall and runoff of streams will dissolve phosphate out of these reservoirs, which forms these little phosphorus pools, per se, in the soil. Right, so that's kind of what's going on right here. Once you have these phosphorus pools, the phosphorus is available for plants, right? So a percentage of phosphorus from this old geologic deposit is now available or precipitates into the soil and is made available to the plants. The plants will absorb it through their roots for use in cellular synthesis. Your animals, right, your little consumers, these little guys here, will obtain phosphorus from plants by eating the plants. Now, upon the death of these animals, or through normal excretion of waste products, they will return phosphorus to the dissolved phosphorus pool in the soil. However, in its dissolved state, a lot of phosphorus is lost by downhill transport into these shallow marine environments, right? So you have runoff into rivers, and then those rivers further dump more of this dissolved phosphorus into water sources or habitats. Now, when this occurs, you can get some interesting ecological events. It's actually even more influenced when you have a large amount of phosphorus returned by excrement, right? So feces entering water sources, or the leakage of phosphates into water sources through agricultural runoff and industrial waste, so sewage or mining practices. Now, kind of going in this sense, what I'm leading up to here is the fact that the phosphorus cycle is what we call leaky or incomplete. In that, so on land, when you have this normal cycling, right, there's some loss of phosphate to insoluble forms, and there's a slow loss of phosphate overall from the land. But when we're talking about oceans and the runoff of phosphates, it's quote unquote leaky. There's a much poorer natural return, and in general, these activities influence that, right? So most of your water systems deal with this delicate balance or delicate level of phosphate that's that should be present. These such practices, right? Again, fertilizers, runoff from mining practices, sewage, agricultural waste, even detergents, they all provide this essential great influx of phosphate into bodies of water. Now, usually, again, by having a limited amount of phosphate in water sources, it acts as a limiting factor in photosynthesis. However, when you add in a huge amount of phosphates, you can greatly increase the productivity of that water system. But that's not a good productivity. It's actually a bad one. What happens is by introducing this huge influx of phosphates, you have excessive growth of aquatic plants that ensue. And they start allowing for or produce, there's a lot of byproducts that begin to accumulate because of that photosynthetic activity, which begins or allows other algae plants to grow. You get algal blooms, which actually start to choke out these water sources and deplete that water source of oxygen. And that leads to a process called eutrophication, which basically you end up with this stagnant, dead water system. Eutrophication can completely disrupt aquatic ecosystems with serious consequences. You see it occurring naturally sometimes, usually during the change between seasons. So you usually see this in, I want to say fall and spring, where the water becomes very stagnant. You don't have a lot of upturn in your water system, so you don't have the constant movement of different water strata and therefore nutrients throughout that system. So different layers will become deoxygenated, and eventually you'll have the buildup or accumulation of detritus, and that will choke out that ecosystem. So this one's often overlooked, but can be very, very nasty as far as improper control of runoff, largely from your industrial processes. All right, so last kind of major thing about ecosystems and this little intro to ecology that I want to talk about is the concept of succession. A characteristic feature of all biological communities is that their structure and composition changes according to certain changes in the environment or environmental conditions. Some of these changes occur in more predictable or more of an orderly fashion. Others not so much. They're more of what we call stochastic events or unpredicted random change. Now, the phenomena through which these changes occur in an ecological community is called ecological succession. Again, this refers to more or less predictable and orderly changes in the composition or structure of an ecological community. Now, this is actually a very important aspect in the study of ecology and really helps to form that the core of ecological science, particularly when you're going into conservation and the preservation of biodiversity, etc. So what causes succession? Again, naturally, you have changes in ecosystems over time, but a lot of times ecological succession can be triggered by some form of disturbance or can even be due to the formation of a new habitat in an ecosystem. When you have these changes, it influences the equilibrium in an environment, and from that you get these successive changes. Now, there's different communities that are created during the stages of succession, right? So pioneer species are the kind of the first and early species to re-enter or revegetate, regenerate an ecosystem or community following that disturbance event or change. Right? So they are the first species to recolonize that area or regrow in that area. A lot of these are your grasses and perennials and annual plants. The next ones are your intermediate species. So these are a lot of species that are not specific per se as far as growth and environmental conditions. They can easily grow in a wide variety of different soil conditions or climatic conditions, and will grow very quickly and take over an area quickly. And this is where you actually start seeing the transitions between shrubs into small trees into larger tree species. And then eventually you'll reach a climax community. Climax community is once that community is almost in equilibrium with the environment. It's once you start reaching an old growth forest. So a hardy forest has now been established and again is in equilibrium or parallel with the surrounding environment or what it was before. Now, again, there's different modes of change that can trigger ecological succession to occur. There's mainly two types of ecological succession: primary succession and secondary succession. Primary succession is a slow process that initiates in areas where there are no living organisms. Right? So this is after an event that has virtually wiped out all existence of life. Essentially a clean slate, right? So this could be like a volcano, is a great example. When you have the lava flow come through, all life is taken out, and you're starting on like a silt bed or a new volcanic flow or a body of water. So it occurs when you have a community that begins to develop on a site that was previously unoccupied by living organisms. Secondary succession occurs when an existing community is disrupted and a new one subsequently develops at the site. Now, with secondary succession, a lot of these disruptions may be caused by a smaller scale natural catastrophe like fires or flooding, even human activity. So deforestation events, plowing, mining can serve as sources of secondary succession. With these, you're not starting from basically a blank slate, right? There is still some life present. It's not completely devoid of life when you have the redevelopment or recolonization of that area. So those are the main differences between the two. Here, you're not establishing a new community in an area that was previously devoid of life. With primary, you're establishing in an area that's been devoid of life for some period of time. You can kind of think of it as basically when moss grows on rocks, right? That happens because you have a rock, somehow soil begins to accumulate, usually because you have the breakdown of the rock. Soil will start to accumulate in the cracks. And once you have soil there, moss can get a foothold and actually start growing. And from there, you can begin to develop more soil. Lichen takes place or comes in. Actually, lichen comes in before moss, but you can start establishing communities on that area. So you're going from bare bones, nothing with primary succession. All right, so I'm going to stop there as far as this intro to ecology. I think that gives you a pretty well-rounded, good introduction to the study and field of ecology. Now, obviously, there is so much more to talk about in this field. The topics of biodiversity, of species interactions, etc. But this was just to, those will come later. This video was to give you kind of an introduction, a hello, a prelude into the field of ecology, and reintroduce you to some of the principal concepts of ecology. So I hope that you are able to walk away with some new information. And if all of this was new information that you learned, that is great. And I hope it enhanced your understanding of kind of some of the concepts of ecology. And continue to look for other videos which will go more in depth with other aspects of the study of ecology.